Why do we kiss under the mistletoe? Possibly the very first known people to make a tradition out of mistletoe were Celtic Druids, who used the evergreen plant during ceremonies thousands of years ago. They believed that a special species of mistletoe that grows on oak trees could heal sickness, protect you against nagging nightmares, and even possibly predict your future. They also considered the mistletoe to be a symbol of vigor, since the plant remained hardy and green, surviving even in the harshest winter months when other plants wilt. As you might imagine, this made the mistletoe quite the must-have winter green for Druids, who would collect them to make cure-alls and even decorate houses for the winter solstice. The winter solstice is the day each year with the least sunlight, making it the shortest day of the year before the days slowly start getting longer. It usually happens on either December 21st or 22nd and was celebrated by many cultures with special celebrations. When Christianity came around, many winter solstice symbols were melded into the new Christmas holiday, including stringing up mistletoe as a decoration. Just like that, mistletoe went from ancient custom to Christmas tradition. Okay, all that makes sense, but that does leave one thing: the kissing. How did puckering up beneath some mistletoe become such a major part of the tradition? Well, it seems to have started in Scandinavian folklore, where the mistletoe plant was first connected to a kiss. According to Norse mythology, the god Odin's son Balder was prophesied to die. Not good. Balder's mom, Frigga, the goddess of love, asked all the animals and all the plants to promise they would never harm him. But Frigga forgot one plant, the lowly mistletoe. So, the scheming god of mischief Loki decided to make an arrow out of mistletoe and used it to strike down the immortal Balder. Really not good. In some versions, the gods managed to bring Balder back from the dead, which made his mom so happy that she said she'd kiss anyone who passed beneath the plant. Sound familiar? Through the Middle Ages, mistletoe continued to become more and more associated with vigor and vitality during cold winter months. And by the late 1700s, it was a common Christmas decoration across much of Western Europe. No one can say for sure when kissing under the mistletoe went from an old folktale to widespread decoration, but it seems to have caught on with English servants before slowly spreading to the middle class, then finally to the rich and fancy. By the mid-1800s in England, the mistletoe tradition was in full swing. In the decades since, the tradition has continued to evolve with the times. Nowadays, a kiss beneath mistletoe is usually reserved for couples, family members, or anyone else you know well and trust. But remember, it's just meant to be fun, so don't feel pressured to pucker up if you don't want to. Unless it's your old Aunt Marie, in which case, you should probably be prepared for a colossal kiss coming your way. Why do we give chocolate on Valentine's Day? The first known culture to connect chocolate to love were the Mayans, who brewed drinks made from cocoa beans at least 2,500 years ago. That was way before the candy, cupids, and carnations of Valentine's Day. This hot cocoa concoction tasted a lot different than the chocolate we usually drink today. It had no sugar in it, which meant it was quite bitter. It was an important part of Mayan weddings. The couple would both take a steaming sip during the ceremony. But it was still another 1,000 years or so before the first known mention of St. Valentine's Day popped up in 1382. It was mentioned in a poem by Geoffrey Chaucer, maybe the most well-known writer of medieval England. At the time, the high courts all across Europe started to focus more and more on the kind of romantic love you might find in a fairy tale. Knights in stories would ride off to rescue their maidens. They'd write songs about their beauty and give sweet gifts to their soulmates. Fast forward a little over 450 years to the 1840s, and Valentine's Day finally starts to transform into the colossal holiday we know it as today. Fancy Valentine's cards became popular as printing technology got better throughout the mid-1800s. This helped the holiday spread far and fast as people sent and received more and more cute cards. So, how did chocolate get involved? For that delicious addition to the holiday, you can thank Richard Cadbury. Name sound familiar? The British chocolate maker was looking for a way to boost sales at his company and saw a huge opportunity to latch on to the Valentine's Day trend. You see, Cadbury and his company had just figured out a new technique for making hot chocolate. The new process left behind a bunch of cocoa butter, which they used to make eating chocolates. With an influx of bite-sized chocolates to sell, and with Valentine's Day becoming ever more popular, Cadbury came up with a plan. He packaged the chocolates into beautiful, detailed boxes that he designed by hand. He shaped them like hearts and covered them in ribbons and roses and cupids and all sorts of romantic things. Cadbury figured the boxes could have two purposes: a beautiful way to gift someone chocolates, then a beautiful box to keep mementos once the chocolates are gone. Cadbury's chocolate boxes took off, and before long, other chocolate makers started to sell Valentine's Day chocolates in heart-shaped boxes. And just like that, chocolate became forever connected to the newly commercialized holiday. And the rest is history. Sweet, delicious history. Are four-leaf clovers lucky? The connection between four-leaf clovers and luck goes all the way back to the ancient world. In fact, lucky four-leaf clovers are even mentioned in the Bible. As Eve was leaving the Garden of Eden, she plucked some four-leaf clovers so she could remember what paradise was like. And it's not just in the Bible. Ancient Celtic Druids living in modern-day Europe also believed that four-leaf clovers were lucky and would carry them around to fend off evil spirits. But why? How did the four-leaf clover end up as a symbol of luck for multiple different cultures? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple if you think about it. They're hard to find. There's only one four-leaf clover for every 5,000 normal ones. That means that about 99.99% of clovers you find have just 3 leaves. If something is that rare, it's easy to see how people would consider it lucky to find one. So that's why four-leaf clovers are a classic symbol of luck, but what causes the occasional four-leaf clover to grow? Experts still aren't sure exactly why it happens, but they believe four-leaf clovers are likely a result of either a rare recessive gene or genetic mutations in the DNA of a clover plant. Oh, and it turns out four-leaf clovers aren't even the most uncommon clover. Yup, 5-leaf clovers are even harder to find in nature and are sometimes called rose clovers by collectors. In super rare cases, clovers are even able to naturally grow with 6 leaves or more. The current world record for the most leaves ever found on a clover stem is 56! It was counted by a man named Shigeo Obara of Japan, who spent his life crossbreeding clovers. He made the amazing find at 84 years old in 2009, after spending 60 years studying how to naturally increase the number of leaves on a clover. Well, that's some well-earned luck right there. Why is Friday the 13th unlucky?
Nobody is exactly sure where the fear of Friday the 13th started, but most experts agree it likely has something to do with the number 12. Throughout history, 12 has been considered a complete number by many cultures. There are 12 months in a year, 12 gods of Olympus in Greek mythology, and 12 sons of Odin in Viking mythology. There are 12 Jewish tribes of Israel, 12 Christian apostles of Jesus, 12 stages of life in Buddhism, and 12 signs of the Chinese zodiac. Since 12 was considered complete, and therefore the perfect number, adding one more number threw off that perfect balance, making 13 an irregular and over time unlucky number. So, why is it Friday the 13th? Over time, Friday has taken on its own significance in Western cultures as an unfortunate bloody day. Most Roman crucifixions took place on Fridays, including the most famous crucifixion of all time, Jesus. So, As Christianity spread, Friday's unlucky reputation spread as well. Over time, Friday the 13th took on its own spooky significance because it was a combination of two separate superstitions. A super superstition! Nowadays, we still see remnants of this superstition in our everyday lives. Many tall buildings skip the 13th floor, street addresses sometimes skip from 12 to 14, and airports occasionally don't have a 13th gate. But, despite all the precautions, many studies have shown that there's no increase in the number of accidents or injuries when Friday the 13th rolls around. So, Friday the 13th might make you a little uneasy, but it's safe to say you probably have nothing to worry about. But, that being said, I'd steer clear of any black cats or broken mirrors. You know, just to be safe.
Do tongues really stick to frozen poles? It turns out your tongue can definitely get stuck to a metal pole on a cold day. Why? Well, you probably know that water can transform into a gas called steam if it gets too hot, and transform into a solid called ice if it gets too cold. And you've probably noticed that your mouth is always full of fluid in the form of saliva. You also may have noticed that it's pretty warm inside your mouth, about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's warm enough to always keep your spit liquid without fear of freezing. But why doesn't your tongue freeze whenever we eat a cold frozen treat like ice cream or popsicles? Well, that's because your tongue does a pretty good job of keeping its temperature up by constantly pumping warm blood throughout. The same is true for the rest of your mouth too. So when you're eating something frozen, you'll be able to warm it up before it has a chance to freeze your tongue. Okay, so that makes sense, but then why doesn't that work for frozen metal poles? Why do our tongues stick to one and not the other? And why just metal and not other materials like plastic? That has to do with something called thermal conductivity. You see, metals are great at heat conduction, which means they absorb heat from other objects really well. How well? Metal conducts heat about 400 times better than your tongue. In other words, heat moves from your tongue or any body part to metal really quickly. Combine metal's ability to conduct heat to your tongue's ability to always be wet, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Or at least a recipe for freaking everyone out. So, when you stick your tongue out on a freezing cold day and touch it to an equally as frozen flagpole, the moisture on your tongue loses its heat until it freezes inside every one of the tiny crevices and grooves. Just like that, your tongue is stuck solid to the cold metal pole in an instant. So, what do? Panic? Pass out? Try and rip it clean off the pole? No, and definitely no. For starters, try and relax. Don't try and pull your tongue off because you'll likely end up leaving a little piece of your tongue behind. And who wants that? Instead, the solution is just about as simple as all the science behind all this tongue-freezing nonsense in the first place. Warm water. That's right. All it takes to release your poor tongue from the pole's icy vice grip is to pour warm water on and around the tongue where it's touching. This should warm up the frozen moisture from your tongue enough to separate without too much of an issue. A surprisingly straightforward solution for every kid's worst nightmare at wintertime. What's the deal with candy corn? A traditional piece of candy corn is made of 3 bands of color, a wide yellow end, an orange center, and a white tip. This kind of makes it look like a kernel of corn, which is where it gets its name. The waxy candy kernels were first invented way back in 1880 by the Wonderly Candy Company and called chicken feed. The treat was meant for rural Americans who lived and worked on farms, and the snack was a quick hit. In the beginning, candy corn was made entirely by hand. Candy makers would mix sugar, corn syrup, a special kind of food wax, and water together, then cook it. fondant and marshmallows were thrown in to soften it up. Then the hot liquid was poured into molds, once for each color. Today, the recipe is basically the same. It's just done by machine so that companies can spit out way more candy than they could by hand. According to the National Confectioners Association, about 9 billion kernels of candy corn are produced every year. That's more than 9,000 tons of candy. Today, we usually think of candy corn as a seasonal treat that turns up each fall just in time for Halloween, but you can actually get it other times throughout the year. Indian corn shows up around Thanksgiving with a brown stripe instead of yellow. Reindeer corn is available around Christmas time and replaces the yellow and orange with red and green. Cupid corn for Valentine's Day is red, pink, and white, and bunny corn is usually pink, green, and yellow for Easter. And in the United States, freedom corn is available around Independence Day and are red, white, and blue. So whether you like candy corn or not, one thing seems clear. Those waxy little sugar kernels are here to stay. Why is there a ball drop on New Year's Eve? The very first ball drop on New Year's Eve happened on December 31st, 1907 in Times Square, right in the center of New York City. The big shining ball of bright light was about 5 feet wide and lit up by 216 electric lamps. It weighed about 700 pounds and had to be lowered by a pulley system. The ball has dropped every New Year's Eve since, with just 2 exceptions, 1942 and 1943, right in the middle of World War II. The idea actually dates back to 1904, 3 years before the first ball drop. You see, by the turn of the century, Times Square had already become a popular place for people to gather on big occasions, like, say, New Year's Eve. That was the case on New Year's Eve 1904. The city streets were packed as the clock struck midnight and a cavalcade of fireworks was set off in the sky over Times Square. Apparently, it was quite the sight, but it also caused quite a commotion as hot ash from the exploded fireworks started to drift down onto the people below. Not good. Fortunately, it sounds like no one was seriously hurt, but city officials took note and decided to ban fireworks 3 years later in 1907. Even without fireworks as a main event planners knew that the show must go on. So they got to work and came up with a new, safer gimmick for midnight, the New Year's Eve ball drop. In the 100+ years since the very first ball drop, there's been 7 different versions of the ball. The one we still drop today was first used in 2008. It's come a long way from the original version. The 12-foot wide geodesic sphere weighs almost 2,000 pounds and is made up of 2,688 crystals and 32,252 LED lights, making it the largest crystal ball in the world. The lights can produce over 16 million colors and billions of different patterns. Okay, so that's how the big ball drop tradition got its start, but why a ball drop? Where did they get that idea in the first place? Well, it turns out it was modeled after an older nautical tradition of dropping the time balls that dates back to England in the mid-1800s. These massive wooden or metal balls were dropped down poles in ports at noontime. This would let the ships in the water know exactly what time it was so they could adjust their clocks to the local time and make sure everything's accurate aboard the ship. So, the people who came up with the New Year's Eve ball drop idea polished off this old naval tradition and added a bit of glitz and glamour in the form of light bulbs, a brand new technology at the time. To this day, it's still a major tradition in the city that attracts thousands of people each year and millions more who watch on TV. So, get your snacks, put on your funny glasses, and enjoy the ball drop this year. And if you get too tired or too bored, remember, It beats being covered in a layer of hot firework ash.